Ferrari rolled into Suzuka with real fire this weekend, and suddenly the whole paddock felt the shift. Charles Leclerc put down a lap in Japanese Grand Prix qualifying that made everyone sit up straight because it exposed something raw about the 2026 power game. Mercedes looked untouchable coming into the weekend, yet that one session sent a clear message that the gap might not be as simple as it first appeared. Leclerc has been saying for weeks that the early races hid the true picture, and China confirmed his fears with a race pace deficit that reached around half a second. Hamilton himself pointed straight at the straights, where Mercedes opens up the ESM and takes a huge step while suffering less derating at the end of long runs. The SF26 showed genuine strength in the corners and tire management, but the electrical sustain on the power unit told a different story, and that is exactly where Ferrari started asking harder questions inside the garage. Now the real tension builds, because if Mercedes is sitting in a carefully managed performance window, the entire ADU system could work against Ferrari instead of helping them close in. What comes next in this season could decide whether this stays a straight fight or turns into something far more strategic, and that is where the story gets even more interesting as we look at Mercedes' hidden energy edge. Mercedes showed up in Suzuka looking strong on paper, but something deeper sits under the surface with their power unit. Lewis Hamilton has been open about where the real difference lives, and it comes down to how long they can keep pushing hard on the straights without fading. That sustain turns a small edge into something much harder for rivals to match lap after lap. Hamilton said after China that the gap shows mostly on the straights, and when they open up the ESM, the car takes a huge step forward. Their W7 suffers less derating at the end of those long runs compared to everyone else, and that lets them hold peak electrical deployment longer. In race conditions, this meant cleaner pace without heavy compromises on battery recharge, and it helped keep tire wear in check over full stints. The data from Australia and China backed it up with consistent straight-line speed that set the early benchmark. This kind of energy mastery raises fresh questions about what the rest of the grid can actually do to catch up, and that brings us straight to how Leclerc saw the picture change in China. Charles Leclerc came out of the Chinese Grand Prix with a clear-eyed view that cut through the early season noise. He admitted the closeness seen in Australia, and the sprint had been somewhat misleading once the real race distances started. The half-second race pace difference that emerged there felt like the moment the true order began to show itself. Leclerc described it as the confirmation of what Ferrari had worried about after testing, and he noted the SF26 felt strong where it mattered in the corners, yet lost time where electrical power mattered most. That gap in race conditions reached around half a second, and it forced the team to look harder at the bigger picture instead of chasing one quick fix. Ferrari Tifosi could take some comfort from the way their driver refused to sound defeated even while facing the facts head on. Yet that admission did not end the conversation inside Maranello, because the engineers kept digging into patterns that went beyond raw speed, and that is exactly where the ADU threshold trap starts to matter for the whole season. Inside the paddock, Ferrari engineers measure every session against the Mercedes benchmark that sets the current ADU rules. The system gives extra development tokens when a manufacturer sits between 2 and 4% behind, or even more beyond 4%. And on paper, it should help close gaps, but the way it works creates a narrow window that teams can try to influence. What no broadcast covered is the quiet belief that Mercedes might be keeping just enough performance in reserve to hold rivals right outside that critical 2% trigger without giving up race wins. Their customer teams provide the FIA with a wide data set, yet none of those cars match the factory operation when it comes to energy management. This setup carries real championship weight because a controlled gap early on could limit how fast Ferrari can bring meaningful upgrades through the year. The situation gets more layered when you add in the technical gray areas still being debated, and that leads directly into the compression ratio debate that has team principals speaking carefully. Toto Wolff played down the possible gain from the compression ratio situation, calling it worth only a few horsepower at most. Max Verstappen gave a much sharper view from the outside, while Fred Vasseur sat somewhere in between and made it clear he does not expect the June changes to reshape everything. The rules set the limit at 16-1 when measured cold at ambient temperature, but questions remain about effective performance once the engine heats up on track. This remains framed as a technical interpretation rather than any clear breach, and it highlights how modern Formula One often turns on how well teams work within the rules as written. Vasseur pointed back to the ADU mechanism as the more important route for Ferrari to make progress, and his comments suggest the team sees the broader framework as the real battleground instead of any single fix. Even with that focus, the conversation keeps returning to whether the advantage lives more in the hardware itself or in the way it gets used, and that opens up the deeper question of operation versus hardware. Mercedes customer teams run the same power unit, yet none have shown the same level of control over energy sustain and derating resistance. The factory W7 avoids heavy superclipping better than the others, and that keeps the balance between speed and battery recharge smoother across a full lap. Inside the garage, the difference looks more like calibration skill than pure parts advantage. Our engineers at Ferrari are already mapping torque curves and testing electronic ways to reconfigure the unit for better balance, while a new internal combustion engine concept runs on the test bench in Maranello. Homologation rules make big changes difficult, so the focus stays on smarter operation and the ADU pathway as one of the few open doors for real gains. The FIA checks output with its own tools and factory simulations, but interpretation still leaves room for experienced teams to find edges. This split between what is built and how it is driven adds another layer of complexity to the season, and it forces Ferrari to build responses on every front of the car package. The SF26 already carries a slight edge in chassis performance through the corners, and it manages tire temperatures more effectively than some rivals. Ferrari pushed hard with the Macarena rear wing and its rotating flap design aimed at cutting drag while lifting overall energy efficiency. Early tests in China delivered useful data even if reliability kept it out of the race itself. Smaller details like the halo winglets show the team chasing every incremental gain across the whole car. A structurally different ICE concept sits on the bench, but bringing it into play faces strict homologation barriers, so the plan relies on cumulative improvements rather than one big leap. Vasseur stressed that the deficit is not limited to the engine, and the team must improve everywhere, including chassis setup and energy management. All of this builds toward key moments coming soon, and that sets up the bigger picture of what the rest of the 2026 season could look like if the current balance holds or breaks. The Monza filming day gives Ferrari a rare chance to collect high-speed data exactly where they lose the most time right now. Engineers will study energy deployment patterns and aero efficiency in real conditions, even if the session is listed as promotional. The first ADU evaluation after Miami will then show whether the performance windows have stayed tight or opened up new opportunities. If Ferrari can push the measured gap outside the narrow band, the development allowances increase and the fight could shift quickly. Every thread from straight line sustain to chassis strengths to regulatory thresholds now points toward the same fork in the road for the championship. Mercedes started the year in the strongest position, but understanding exactly how that advantage works is the first step toward challenging it. The 2026 season has become a test of more than just car speed. It has turned into a contest over who reads the full rule book and the system around it better than anyone else.